Welcome to the Afghanistan Project Podcast. I'm your host, Beth Bailey, and today my guests are some incredible Americans, members of Team Alpha, the original 8-man team of analysts, linguists, warriors, and tribal experts who went into Afghanistan to defeat Al-Qaeda in the days immediately following September 11, 2001. David Tyson retired from the CIA Directorate of Operations in 2020 after a 25 career at the agency that involved numerous overseas deployments and 2 rotations as the chief of station. David received the CIA's Distinguished Intelligence Cross, the agency's highest award for valor, and the agency's Distinguished Career Intelligence Medal. He also served in the U.S. Army both as an enlisted service member and as an officer. Justin Sept is a contingency strategist for Constellus and recently retired as a U.S. Army Green Beret colonel following 30 years of exceptionally distinguished service. He received numerous military decorations during that service: Defense Superior Service Award and the Bronze Star with V device. I cannot, again, say how much of an honor it is to have you both here to talk about what you did in those early days and what you're continuing to do for the Afghans who were there with you. So thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you.
My pleasure.
Justin, let's get started with you. You graduated from the Q course in 2000. What was it like being chosen for this incredible mission to infiltrate Afghanistan after 9/11?
Well, it was definitely, it wasn't something that I could have anticipated at all. I mean, I was a student, actually, when 9/11 happened. I was at dive school, the combat divers course in Key West, Florida. And we had just finished a dive, a morning dive, and when we learned of the attacks of 9/11, and things were pretty fluid after that. We ended up returning to 5th Group. I had no idea what was going on in terms of our missions, whether we were going to deploy or not. We assumed that would happen, but I had no clue. I had no way of anticipating that I would be detailed to the Central Intelligence Agency. And when I got back, I think it was a Friday night, the next morning, Saturday, I met with my commander, and they told me, hey, look, we have a requirement. They didn't say the CIA, they didn't use that word, but they said, hey, we're going to probably not see you again. You're going to go in and do a pilot team mission, what we call a pilot team mission. That means you go in ahead of the Special Forces team to sort of set the stage for their arrival. And then later on that day, I learned that it was going to be the CIA and that there were 3 of us. So I was one of 3 that were detailed to the Central Intelligence Agency. And so it was very much a whirlwind, unanticipated, and I was just holding on for dear life so I wouldn't fall off and offend somebody and get fired. I was just worried about doing the right thing. And it happened very fast.
That sounds absolutely incredible. David, what about you? How did you get chosen for Team Alpha, and what was that experience like?
Well, I had been in Central Asia for a couple of years. Since 1998, I had been stationed in Central Asia. And although I was by no means an Afghan expert, I had some experience inside Afghanistan before 9/11, dealing with a warlord, and before that time, as a student, when I was a young man, a graduate student, I'd spent several years in Uzbekistan learning the language and so forth. So prior to 9/11, I was dealing with Afghanistan issues with the agency, and sort of becoming smart on Afghanistan and the various issues there. And then, so when 9/11 did happen, it was sort of, a natural thing for me to be involved in the movements into Afghanistan.
That is like the dream team scenario. I mean, I feel like if that model would have been utilized for the next 20 years, we could have probably progressed maybe even more than we did. What was that like, working together with such different backgrounds, but obviously being at such elite levels of the things that you were both good at, that team coalesce? I'll let you start, Justin.
Well, I think it was really interesting because I was somewhat familiar with the way the CIA was organized and kind of the quality of the people and the different sort of divisions of the CIA, for lack of a better word, how they were organized and who was recruited, because my dad was a CIA officer. So when I met with these folks, I knew kind of who they were and kind of what they were trained to do. But these guys were a bit different because they were all military, which isn't the case, right? Now, it wasn't the case 20 years ago. They were all military. Some were special forces, some weren't, but everybody had some foundational military experience in addition to being a CIA officer. And of course, Dave had these very exquisite language skills, which were absolutely indispensable. And then we had JR, our team leader, who was a Dari speaker and had spent a lot of time working in Afghanistan dating back to the late 80s during the Soviet War of Aggression. So we really had a lot of talented guys with a lot of experience both in the agency and also in the military. So I knew I was with a bunch of really highly qualified people, and I just wanted to make sure I did my job well and that no one, and I didn't let them down.
How about you, David? Same question. How was that being in that group in the beginning?
Yeah, as Justin sort of alluded to, we did not really know each other before all this happened, which is sort of counterintuitive, I guess, for team activities when you're talking about whatever type of activity you go as a team. You should know each other before you start your work, so to speak. But it was something that was natural, I think, for us in the agency. We're kind of used to doing things that way, and the agency consists of pretty great people generally, and when we get together, we can do great things. So for me, it was. Well, Justin and I were both relatively young officers, so to speak. And so we were learning everything as we went anyway. So we had no prior experience being on in such a moment, so to speak, at such a time. So it was it was a pretty noticeable learning curve, but that's sort of what we expected and what we signed up for. At the time, I don't think any of us felt intimidated or anything like that. I personally knew that my teammates would be from the agencies. The majority of them were special activities officers, meaning as Justin spoke about, men with a great degree of skill and experience in military special forces, SEALs, Rangers, all that kind of cool stuff that you grow up hearing about or so forth. And that those guys were, when I knew it was those kind of people as the core members of the team, I felt very good about everything just because of their reputation and so forth.
That's really incredible. Now, part of the reason that you're here today is to talk about the Afghans who were part of this mission with you. And so how did you identify Afghans who were going to work alongside you? Did you already have contacts in the country, or was that part of the early effort, finding people who could help you conduct that mission? How about Justin? I'll let you start again.
So I think a little bit of context. So there was some limited contact that Dave participated in directly. I'll let him discuss that. In the 2 years leading up to 9/11, this was all kind of designed to maintain our connection, the U.S. government's connection with the resistance in the Northern Alliance, which was led by Ahmad Shah Massoud. So there were those connections. There were connections, I think, were less deliberate connections, but they existed with some of the other warlords, particularly Dostum, Abdul Rashid Dostum, who was the warlord we ended up working with. At the time, I knew the names of some of these guys because I had been a summer intern at the CIA and the Directorate of Analysis. So that was just sort of incidental. But I didn't know who we were going to link up with. So for my part, I didn't know any of them. I think it's fair to say we didn't really know any of the guys we ended up working with. Maybe Dave had talked to Dostum before. I can't remember Dave. Maybe you had, maybe you hadn't, but certainly Dave had the closest connectivity to the ethnic group, the Uzbeks, who comprised the majority of the guys we worked with, and maybe a lesser extent with some of the Tajik guys that were represented by Masood's, people. And so he had some connectivity, but generally speaking, these were new people that we hadn't worked with. So it was very much like an understanding of the culture, kind of what they had been through, but I didn't have any personal connection with any of them. So it was all kind of a cold start for me.
Yeah, and I guess, Justin sort of summed it up. We did not have a lot of knowledge or experience with these Afghans, namely the commander we were going to deal with, Abdul Rashid Dostum. We had really no personal contact with him prior to our showing up, at his base camp, and after 9/11. But we knew something about him. We knew things from other contacts who knew him fairly well, knew about him. And then, of course, there was reporting in the press, there was reporting in the media and so forth, which was largely, for our intensive purposes, inaccurate. But I think we had a fairly, or at least I had a fairly good feel for who this guy was, who these people were, and I guess, as Justin sort of pointed out, that the main point is we just had to get in there and deal with this guy. He agreed to work with us, and that was good enough for us. And that's basically how it started. So it wasn't a thoroughly planned out operation. Obviously, there was we were compelled to just get in there and start because of what happened on 11 September. So that's sort of what the agency does, is go into situations that require activity and action without a whole lot of preparation. Perhaps that's kind of what we do best.
And what kind of role play for you, the ones who would be enabling your efforts? Because I assume they were a large part of what you were doing. I mean, they clearly matter enough to you that you are now devoting a large part of your lives to supporting them. So tell me about that connection that you grew while working with them, what they were helping you to do. Could you have done that work without the Afghans who were helping you? Justin, I'll let you start again.
Yeah, the answer is absolutely no way we could have achieved what we achieved without them. They were absolutely indispensable. If anything, we were sort of supporting them. They were the main effort, is the way we looked at it. One of the individuals that we ended up helping, Badger 6 did, was the guy who was our guide to meet with one of the other ethnic groups, another warlord named Karim Khalili. He was absolutely indispensable. So we would never have met with that warlord. We never would have been able to bring in an SF team and a CIA team to link up with that individual in central Afghanistan without this individual, who we later helped bring back to the U.S. and resettled him and his family. So there's so many anecdotes, examples we could pull from, but I'd say that's probably the best one for me. But in general, you got to remember all the ground fighting, the ground tactical piece was conducted by the Northern Alliance. We supported them in a variety of ways, to include with advisory support, with air power, with political support, with just all sorts of things that America brings to the table. But at the end of the day, these guys were the main effort, and so it's really it was the least we could do to help them after August 2021, after all they had done in the early days of after 9/11.
Yes, I would only add that, our numbers, there were 8 of us on Team Alpha, and there were 12 Green Beret men, ODA men, plus a couple of combat air controllers. So that's basically 20 guys, and there's not a whole lot, 20 guys can do by themselves. And as Justin said, all the real fighting was done by our Afghan allies. And we have to stress at this time, in 2001, 95 to 97% of the country of Afghanistan was controlled by the enemy, meaning the Taliban and Al-Qaeda forces. And the Afghans that we worked with, those who were, wanted to work with us, essentially volunteered to work with us, and at certainly at great risk. There was no, although we ended up being successful and defeated the Taliban on the battlefield and so forth in several months, there was no guarantee of that, obviously, when we went in. So these Afghans were basically risking it all to fight with us. We did not hire them. We did not pay them. They were not contracted to us or anything like that. They just sort of volunteered and fought by our side, so to speak, under their own commanders. But, at the time, it was a very, very tenuous situation, and their willingness to fight with us and basically take orders from us to a degree was done at great risk. They assumed a great deal of risk. There was certainly no guarantee that any of this would work out, and if it didn't work out, they would all be killed, essentially.
Yeah, it makes me think.
Yeah, I just add
the
to
later years. Oh, go ahead. Yeah, please, Justin, go ahead.
No, sorry. I just it's important to realize that at that point in the game, things were so immature, what we call immature in that theater of operations, that we were completely dependent on the Afghans for our food, for all our sort of sustenance, for lack of a better word, because the U.S. supply system only could reach us by air, by parachute. So a lot of the supplies that came in were focused on humanitarian assistance and, mission essential stuff. So we were basically dependent on the Afghans for our food and all our sort of support. Certainly in the first month of that operation, before they, we started to get more reliable supplies, but it was really a real dependency. And the Afghans were crucial to supporting us.
I just have to ask, I'm hoping that you got fed a lot of bolani and Kabuli pulao in those days, because that would maybe make it extra worth the while.
It never got old, actually, and that's saying a lot for cuisine. So I was happy, and I never felt like I was super hungry. There were a couple long days there where you're a little hungry, but yeah, they took good care of us.
I believe it. Afghan hospitality is unrivaled. So at least you were well cared for in that way. Tell me about, so I was immediately thinking about the target on these people's back, because in the later years, before we started recording, I was saying that I got involved in, studying and being in the intel community, 2010. And at that point we were telling people, hey, you need to work with us, and then you'll be eligible for SIV. Or actually, when I started, there was no SIV program still, but it was, if you work with us, we're not going to leave your side. There was a kind of a contract in place, an understood contract. But when you started, it was really, that was just, do you want your country to be free from this force? And tell me about the target then that was on these Afghans' back in those days, and then when you left. I mean, I know of so many reprisals that happened for those who worked with us as interpreters and other forces, but did all of those Afghans who were supporting you in those early days, Justin, I'll let you start again.
Yeah, I mean, many of these individuals were, probably like in their 30s, maybe in their early 40s, in some cases in their 20s. So by the time August 2021 rolled around, these guys were kind of the OGs, the original guys. They were quite a bit older than the other Afghans that have been working with the U.S. So they didn't have the IDs. They didn't have all this stuff that was developed over 20 years in Afghanistan. And all of a sudden, they're marked because especially the older Taliban knew who they were, remembered them. Because, you have the sort of core Taliban that are from the south, Kandaharis, this sort of thing. But then you have kind of local Taliban folks who know everybody in the area or are familiar with who's who in the zoo. And so those guys were targeted mainly by the folks that knew them based on they had fought them. And, in Afghanistan, at the end of our victory, most of the Taliban were allowed to go home, back to their families, provided they surrendered their arms and this sort of thing. So it wasn't like these guys got banished or imprisoned or whatever. They were around. So for the core cohort of folks that supported us, they were very much under threat, mainly by their peers who were Taliban that knew them from over 20 years. And many of them were senior guys. Some were district governors. I think in one case we had an individual who was in parliament. We had generals. These are all prominent, successful people that were really easy targets. So in many cases, they had no choice but to get out of Afghanistan.
Yeah, I'd just add that, as Justin said, this was 2001, so 20 years later. But as Justin said, these men, almost all of them, went on to do different things for the Afghan government and cooperated with the United States, for the next 20 years. Some of them became generals in the Afghan army, the intelligence services, the Ministry of Interior, and Justin mentioned the parliament. So, and the notoriety that they got in 2001, they were kind of known, locally as kind of heroes and the first guys who worked with the Americans. And that sort of that sort of branded them for the rest of their lives, so to speak. So they had a lot of notoriety, not only because of the service and their positions that they attained, but because of their work with the Americans back in 2001 and 2002. So, and as we were talking about, there were none of them ever attempted to get. I don't even think they knew what an SIV was, even in 2021. None of these men worked with us with this idea that they would someday get some kind of SIV or something like that. None of these men had that in their mind. So and there was no contract, again, there was no payments made to them and so forth. So when all these programs began, and when 2021 came along and the disaster happened in Afghanistan, these guys really had nothing to look forward to in terms of ties to the United States. All this, they had nothing, no credentials, and no way to apply for any kind of program to get to the United States.
Yeah, this is one of the things that's so galling to me, having tried to support so many, special immigrant visa applicants or people who worked with our forces. I mean, the first person I met who had was trying to find citizenship, it was in 2009, I want to say. And he had worked with my friend's father. He had been part of Operation Anaconda, and there was a death threat against him, and they threw him on a U.S. military jet and brought him to Alexandria, Virginia. But there was no SIV program. He had no means to actually obtain citizenship at the time. And I think it took many, many years to try to get that for him, or people that I'm familiar with who worked on CIA bases, right? And there is no paper trail of being hired, or it's difficult to find the people who actually supervise them because of the clandestine nature all these people who really have the most ability to qualify, right, for that protection from this country sometimes have the most trouble proving that they had that service. And obviously it sounds like anybody who worked with Team Alpha has the same problem. SIV requires that you were paid by the US government, that you have those documents that show, what your term of service was, what your contract was. Well, there was no contract. There was none of that. And so I can already see where the wrinkles are going to come in this story. So tell me about when you started trying to help these individuals. To you, were you thinking, oh my goodness, these guys are stuck back in Afghanistan and we want to do something? Like, how did this whole effort for you to start? David, I'll let you start this time, actually.
Yeah, it all started in essentially, I guess, July and August 2021. I had not really been in contact with any of these men. I had sort of followed their careers, so to speak, but it was not something that in the agency you're really supposed to do, is have contact with people like this after you work with them. So, I avoided contact, essentially. I knew where many of them were and so forth, and, again, followed their careers. Many of them were killed or died in the years that, between 2001 and 2021. Afghanistan's a dangerous place, obviously, especially when you're fighting the Taliban and Al-Qaeda. However, when things started to go south, so to speak, in July and August, I started to get contacted by some of these guys who used their resourcefulness and basically found ways and found my number and my wife's phone number and so forth, and I started to get WhatsApp calls and contacts. And within, a week or so, I was talking to 5 or 6 or 7 of these commanders, and working feverishly with the many, many other Americans, veterans and so forth, who were trying to find ways to help get their guys out via the evacuation routes in Kabul, U.S. military evacuation. And so we got into those networks, and we were able to evacuate, I think it was 4 families in 2021. A relatively small number of men and their families in 2021. And again, it was all part of that ad hoc mass movement of American veterans and the U.S. military and the CIA was evacuating personnel, and we used our contacts and so forth to get some of our people on those aircraft. Our problem essentially was that the vast majority of our men and their families were located in northern Afghanistan, not in Kabul, not in the Kabul area, and it was impossible for them in all this upheaval and chaos to get down there to the flights. So most of our people were stuck in the north. Some of them fled to Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, and other surrounding countries. And some of them just went into hiding in Afghanistan. So and starting in 2021, like everybody else, we started this process, and it continues today.
For me, I was actually at Bethesda hospital, military hospital, getting an MRI done. And I came back and I remember checking my email, and I think I had an email from Shannon Spann, it's Mike Spann's widow, asking me if I knew so-and-so. And then there was just this deluge of emails that came in. And this was all happening as everything was unfolding on the TV that you saw, people, swarming the Kabul International Airport, the flights going out, people hanging on, all this stuff was kind of happening in parallel. And it was really frustrating because we just started doing all we could do, which was start processing paperwork. It was SIVs and P1s and sending them both through the military and to other channels in the hopes that someone would process them. Of course, there were thousands of other people doing the same thing. If you were in the North, as Dave said, you had a genuine case of hard luck because it was all about being proximate and around the airfield. If you could get into the inner perimeter, your chances of getting out were much better. Our guys, almost to a man, and their families were all up north, so that was not possible. It's not easy. You can go through the Slang Pass to get to Kabul, or you can go over the mountains and go through Bamiyan to get to Kabul. And otherwise, the geography kind of forces you to go north into Uzbekistan or Tajikistan. So that's what happened. And then some people kind of bedded down in Afghanistan and, kind of hid out and were moving from house to house, really under duress. So it was pretty chaotic and really heart-wrenching because there was only so much you could do, which was amounted to paperwork and then coordination. Meanwhile, there's all these other things going on like Pineapple Express and all that. There's a bunch of these sort of efforts that were coalescing really through social media and through the internet. We wouldn't have been able to do it without that technology. And so this all happened in parallel, and it was really chaotic.
So I have I have two follow-up questions. The first one's really brief. Did you guys use the Panjshir gas station to get people in, just out of curiosity?
Yeah, we had one or two families. Now, I don't know if we called it the Panjshir gas station, but there was a gas station that I remember. We sent people to a gas station to get picked up. I don't know if that's the same thing you're referring to or not.
I believe that it is. I'll have to talk to you guys about that after we get off today, but just out of curiosity, I needed to know that answer. The other thing is, I didn't think about this before I formulated questions for you all. Afghanistan, the fact that you've got a lot of Tajiks and Uzbeks, and I know because I've had Amnesty International researchers come on here talking about and I've had some of my own sources telling me about the incredible, almost bordering on genocidal actions that have taken place in northern Afghanistan in the aftermath of the Taliban's takeover, because they know that the Tajiks up in northern Afghanistan have a propensity to join what now is the NRF, and they recognize that is a threat to their organization. So has that posed a problem for the people who worked with you, that hating upon Tajiks? At least, I'm not sure as much about Uzbeks, but since you mentioned earlier that a lot of the people who worked with you were with the Northern Alliance and were Tajik, has that been a problem for them in the aftermath of this, the Taliban's takeover?
Yeah, I would say yes, of course. I mean, it's hard to, Afghanistan's hard to understand, the ethnic issues, but in many ways, what's been happening in Afghanistan for many years has a strong ethnic component. And this is we can argue about all this, but in some ways it was a civil war that we got involved in, and that everybody's getting involved in now. And it's there's certainly Pashtuns that they fight against each other, but when you talk about the ethnic groups there, it's largely the Pashtun ethnic groups against everybody else. And, these have sort of historical antecedents and everything that sort of guides all this along. But certainly the Tajiks from the Panjshir and the Hazaras from the Bamiyan area, and the Hazaras, the Shias in general, are seen by the Taliban, or largely seen by the Taliban as apostates and so forth, and the Uzbeks included too. So all of our people, again, as I tried to stress before, because they worked with us in 2001, there's a special brand that they carry as being the first guys that helped us and worked with the Americans, and they're especially, hated by the Taliban. So, that plus the ethnic factor has made their lives extremely difficult and dangerous inside Afghanistan.
Yeah, I mean, can't really add too much to that other than to say that having worked both in the North and in the South and seen both kind of societies, I mean, it's a fragmented country, and these folks, just by dint of their ethnicity or their sectarian affiliation, they're going to be targeted. The Hazaras are particularly abused, have been abused by the Pashtun majority, and particularly the Taliban. I should qualify that. But also the Uzbeks and the Tajiks. But I'd say that the minorities that are smaller in population, relatively speaking, are obviously easier to be oppressed, and there's no trust. There's a dearth of trust between many of them, and so that makes cooperation difficult, and that makes conflict almost inevitable. And so the folks that we work with happen to be the minorities that were always kind of on guard, because they were always defending their area against this much larger sort of group. And then you got to remember also, it's very complicated because there's history there. So there's communities within northern Afghanistan that were essentially the results of ethnic cleansing, both in the mountains of the central part of the country, and then also in the north in the late 1890s, in the 1890s, early 1900s, there was forced resettlement. And those communities have never really sort of assimilated with each other. And so you have these natural tensions between these different neighborhoods, for lack of a better word, different areas. Like Kunduz, for example, is a great big city, large population that are not necessarily Uzbek or Tajik or Hazara. And so there's constant tension there.
This is great to have. I'm learning new things, which is really something that I love to do about Afghanistan, and I appreciate you bringing all of that in. It's the thing that has always drawn me to this country is just the sheer amount of difficulty has had to face, trying to bring peace and stability because of all of those centuries of conflict and war, and it's just been, there are so many levels of difficulty here that are all playing together, and I think that's something that also turns people off from learning about Afghanistan, is that it is complex, but it's something that's really rewarding to learn about too. Moving forward to, I said earlier that I can understand why SIV was a difficult path to pursue, because obviously you didn't stop after August of 2021 and say, okay, well, you guys are stuck in. I don't know any evacuation volunteers who did that. You just said, okay, you're on your own now. Sorry. You now know that the Taliban are beginning to start this countrywide reprisal campaign with door-to-door searches throughout the country, and that it's a very dangerous place to be, and just how dangerous it is for the people who worked with you. So what paths did you try the SIV program, or did you immediately start using some of the other programs that were available? What were those early post-August days like?
I think we tried both, or I'd say that we just tried every avenue. So we'd make one set of paperwork, SIV, because that was considered to be the kind of gold standard, right? And I would typically, if I knew them, I could vouch for them, right? Having fought with them or been with them in, the early days of 2001. And then we'd also, for folks that maybe didn't meet the same criteria, we do P1 applications, and then it varied. But in the end, it became more P1 because the SIV criteria are pretty strict, and so it just made more sense to do the P1s. Some folks we did the paperwork for, and they were fortunate enough, a few of them got on the planes and were ushered to one of the lily pads, like flown to Qatar, I think. They were brought ultimately to Germany and then the States, and they were processed for asylum, if I recall. So they were basically, if you got on the plane, you were good. That was the bottom line. You might have to spend some time in a tent, a month or so, but at the end of the day, the system was going to take care of you. It was the folks that didn't get out that we kind of spent time helping the folks that got out on paperwork, but in the end, that became sort of moot because they were already going to be taken through that process in some fashion. So then we focused on the folks who didn't get out, and most of them became P1 applicants.
Yeah, I'll just add that, in 2021, we knew virtually nothing about any of these things. What's a P1, what's an SIV, there was humanitarian parole, and so we sort of went after shiny objects when people told us, hey, this will work, and this, and virtually nothing worked for us. Because as we've been talking about, our men did not qualify, our families did not qualify at all for SIVs. And, for a while there, some of us thought that maybe we could get that to work. And of course it doesn't work. Now, as I think Justin did point out, Justin had a couple interpreters that were formally, hired by the USG, and those things could move forward. But for the vast majority of Badger 6, and we haven't really talked about Badger 6 at all, but for our guys from 2001, none of those men qualified for SIVs. So we went through this whole gamut of, feverish attempts to fill out applications for all kinds of stuff that almost never worked. And the only thing that stuck in the end was the P1. And that's what we're working on now with our people.
Yeah, let's talk about Badger 6. Go ahead, Justin, if you want to bring something up before that, that's perfectly great.
No, I was just going to say, to Dave's point, I had done, in like 2012, I'd gone through the SIV application process for my interpreter. So I understood the sort of requirements of that. And I also understood the timeline, how long it took. And it's quite a lengthy process. And he was my interpreter on a base in southern Afghanistan. So it was like the classic, criteria were met. With our guys from 01 and 02, it was very different, circumstances, less evidence, right? You didn't have any paperwork, this sort of thing. I even had, NCOs who were from Honduras help me with the SIV because they had in fact been brought in on SIV. So I had a lot of help. This time around, it was trial and error, and then we eventually landed on P1 as the most, let's just say, the most viable route. But we didn't know, until, it's been a couple of years now we've been working on this. It just took time to figure out where the system was going to work and where the system didn't work and where the bottlenecks were.
I can only imagine, just because I was part of some of those early efforts from November of 2021 on, and I remember, okay, let's file HP, and everybody had HP applications in, and none of those, I think only 1,000 or 1,600 or so of like 44,000 applications even got looked at, much less, conditionally approved. And that's years and years later. And then everyone was trying to do P1 and P2 if they could. But what they didn't realize is that promise of 12 to 18 months of processing wasn't going to start right away. And that some people would get referred but not get an ARR number, and all of these complex time. And I can imagine some of the things that must have come up for you guys, and I'd love to hear about them. But before that, I want to hear about Badger 6. When did you start Badger 6, and what was the initial purpose and reason for creating an actual organization?
Well, I think it started in earnest at the end of 2021 into 2022. We got together guys like myself, Justin, Shannon Spann, the widow of Mike Spann. Mike Spann was a Team Alpha member who was killed in action, 25 November 2001. And sort of, we get in his memory and in our own, efforts to help our Afghans, we got together, a number of us, and we created the nonprofit called Badger 6. Badger 6 was a call sign, and Justin can go into that detail. I'll let him do that. So that was our nonprofit, and it came about after one of our guys said, "Hey, can you send me a couple $100? I'm in Pakistan. I need some money to live." And we were going like, wow, that we probably will need some money here to help our Afghans. And that sort of spurred on this thing. Shannon Spann has done just a tremendous job at organizing things for us, being sort of the tenacious, disciplined person who goes in and figures things out and gets things done in terms of organizational things and so forth. So she did most of the work to create the nonprofit and continues to do much of the work. And obviously, as you know, fundraising is a big deal, and we started to try to get funds to help our Afghans wherever they were. And from that, we created a board and all that stuff you need to do, and did fundraising and so forth, and got smart and continue to try to get smart on how to help our Afghans and how to shepherd them through the process and make sure that they can, live in the meantime before they get here. And of course, that is taking a very, very long time. So Badger 6, it's badger6.org on the internet, and you can look it up and hear about or read about what we're all about. The thing about Badger 6 is we're not an open-ended help Afghanistan thing. We're very limited, and in terms of our scope and those who we help. These are only men in the families of the people we worked with in 2001, 2002. So we know them all by name. We know all their family members. We know the widows. We know where they live. We know, we dealt with these people a great deal. They earned our support in 2001 and 2002, and we're trying to, give back now to them. But these are about 30 to 35 families that we know personally and we can vouch for, and they're in the system, so to speak, in the Badger 6 system, and that's it. After we help them get to the place they need to go, be it the United States or somewhere else, our mission will be complete, and that's what Badger 6 is all about.
Yeah, I just explained the sort of genesis of Badger 6, the word, or the title or the name of our 501c3. So in the early days after we arrived in 2001, the team, out of necessity, had to split into different elements. So it split into 3 elements. This was the CIA team of 8 people that Dave and I were on. 3 of those people comprised myself, Mike Spann that we spoke of, and then a gentleman named Mark Rosenberger who passed away a couple years ago while deployed with the CIA. And he was a medic at the time. He later became a paramilitary officer. But the 3 of us, Mike, Mark, and myself, went to a place called the Yakalang Valley, which is in central Afghanistan, right in the heart of Afghanistan, like the geographic center. And we brought in a CIA team, an SF team, to link up and work with the Hazara warlord. Our call sign was Badger 6, and I can't remember why we picked that, but it was just sort of a natural thing. We picked it, and then that name stuck. So years later, when Shannon was really, the force behind the organizational savvy and all that for the charity, that became the moniker we picked. But it was interesting. It was like a natural progression. We went from helping, and kind of coordinating informally to, 3 or 4 months into it going, hey, we should probably create a charity, a 501c3, so we can get all the benefits of filing for a 501c3 and so forth. And then that led naturally into that coincided with our desire to raise money. Then we needed to raise money mainly because not for the folks that were in the U.S. or en route to the U.S. through the lily pad system, but for the folks that were stuck in Afghanistan to sustain them in Central Asia as well, to sustain them while they were applying for some sort of status, usually P1 status. And so that was how Badger 6 was formed. It was really a natural progression and a compelling need to raise money to support these people.
You've laid out everything really pragmatically on the site, showing how much it costs to care for a family in Afghanistan, which I think is around $700 a month, versus Pakistan, which is around $1,800, which makes perfect sense. The cost of living is so much higher in Pakistan. And then you have attendant difficulties in different places, right? In Afghanistan, you have to worry about the Taliban showing up on your door and murdering you, or otherwise harming other family members. In Pakistan, you have the fact that you can't work. You can't send your children to school as refugees. You have these higher costs of living. And now I had a source the other day send me video and pictures of the Pakistanis sending Afghans back to their country, which is highly concerning. Even people with that letter of protection from the U.S. government that is supposed to keep them from being deported back to Afghanistan. And so you've got people with various levels of difficulty that you're trying to keep, focused on a future that is not unknown, but the timing is unknown. And there are all these difficulties. What is that like? Keeping up spirits, and even on the home front, it's not easy to assimilate into the U.S. With knowing that your family, your distant family is still in Afghanistan and facing difficulties. So how does that weigh on the team at Badger 6, or is it not? Are you able to handle that pretty well?
I mean, yeah, it does. I mean, it's a huge dynamic. I mean, it varies from individual family. Like each family is a little bit different, but the themes are pretty much the same. Like, in some cases, you have families that came in one cohort, which is, ideally the way it would happen, or maybe in two cohorts. And, but because these families are quite large, and the problem is you have kids that are adult age or older, and so that makes things obviously more complicated. Or you'll have dependents that somehow made it to Turkey, for example, but the principal was, able to make it through the lily pad system or something like that. So it really depended where the cards fell, in the months after August 2021. And so you just have to deal with that. I'd say another aspect is not unique to Afghan culture, but an aspect of Afghan culture is that, your eldest son is typically leaned on heavily by the principal. So let's say his dad worked with us. His dad probably didn't speak English because he didn't need to. Like, he was a prominent guy in his country. But fortunately, his eldest son or maybe his daughter learned English over the past 20 years. So those kids become very important because they can communicate. They can do a lot of the work that's required in the first days and first weeks and months after you arrive in Afghanistan. But if you don't have that, and we've had guys who come over separated from their family, they're waiting for their son or daughter to come over, and it's really tough on them because they don't speak the language. They're in their 50s. They were someone prominent in their country, and now, they're at best, working sort of, some sort of wage labor job to make ends meet. So it is tough, and it is a factor. And but it's better to be here working that way than it is to be in Afghanistan. But these families are often scattered, and then they sort of connect, over the past year or two. That started to happen, but it's uneven and it's sort of disjointed.
Yeah, I would just add the hardest part. You know, you're you have the enemy, so to speak, the Taliban. You know you have problems in Pakistan. You know you have issues with visas in Uzbekistan or Turkey or Tajikistan. So you understand the foreign component, and there's all this ambiguity, ups and downs, back and forth. That we accept that, and we deal with that. What the hardest thing is for me is dealing with, or trying to deal with, trying to get transparency into our own government and our own system, and how that all works, and trying to find agency. That's the word I guess we use today. Trying to affect the system in a positive way to get your people out, because I would say most of us believe or have the perception that the system is not working, and that could be a mistaken perception, but we have no way of knowing, because there is no clarity. We have no points of contact inside these various. There's several cogs in the machine, right? There's IOM, PRM, CARE, and other organizations. There's DHS, obviously, USIS. All of these, rightly so, they have their part to play, and they have their own administrative and bureaucratic functions. But for us, most of this is a mystery. If it's not a mystery, it's just very frustrating to try to deal with, because no one really will talk to you about things. No one will talk about your case, or inform you of things. And a missing email address. If you miss an email address or a phone number's wrong, you go to the back of the line and you're forgotten. And nobody tells you until some serendipitous thing happens that you learn that your case is stuck for some reason. So these are the most frustrating things, and we've been doing this now in earnest since 2022, and here it is 2025, and we've had only limited success. And we have friends, just like everybody else. We're working hard with our government partners and with people inside the government, back and forth. And it's not that we don't have supporters. We have great supporters in some cases, but the ultimate frustration is, in spite of all that, in spite of doing all these forms, and in spite of getting all these recommendations and so forth, our people aren't moving, or it seems they're not moving, and we have no clarity or insight, at least in a meaningful way, as to where our cases are.
Yeah, and when you make inquiries, there's no, it doesn't even reward self-advocacy or personal initiative. You would think that would be something like, another bureaucracy like the VA or something. May not work perfectly, but eventually you're going to get some sort of response or an update, or a letter in the mail. Here, it's very much like a black box. You do everything that you're expected to do, at least based on the criteria that's listed online. But you have to assume it's deliberate, that they don't want to interact with you as the advocate or as the principal or whomever you are. That you're just expected to wait for a response to emerge from their system. It appears to be very stovepipe, but it's deliberately set up, in my estimation, so that you can't get any detailed response. It's always like, your stuff is being processed, and be patient, kind of thing. But 6 months, a year maybe, but now we're talking 3-4 years. I mean, that's really that's indicative of a problem.
I couldn't agree more. And as somebody who has been petitioning the government for updates on those numbers. It's frustrating to me too. I'm not asking for specifics about cases because I know that they won't give them to me. I'm asking, how many P1 and P2 applicants have you brought into the country so far of the, I think they have had 54,000 petitions and 28,000 accepted for P1 and P2 at the last check. And it's like, just tell me how many. And they can't even say how many have been brought in. They'll tell you to go look at this nebulous list that doesn't say the answer at all, so that they can say that they published the number. It's absolutely insane the amount of obfuscation that has happened from the federal government about issues with these programs. So it's always hard to hear that from people who have the attachments to the individuals they're trying to support and that are stuck in this morass. I'm sorry to hear it. I guess my final.
Can I just add one thing?
Please.
The thing that hurts us the most personally is that these Afghans, Justin was a colonel, right, in the U.S. Army. Yeah. A very successful career. I was a senior officer in my agency. Mm-hmm. And the Afghans, are used to dealing with different problems and different things. But they, of course, believe that people like me and Justin can get things done for them, retired or not. And guess what? We can't do crap for them, really, other than what we've already done. Their names are in the system. Their applications are processing. They're getting interviews or not, or whatever. And they are calling us constantly saying, what's up? And then one guy gets an interview, and of course they all know each other or know of each other. Mm-hmm. And they say, why'd you get this guy interviewed before me? Or why did this family get out and move here or whatever? Mm-hmm. And we have to say, Commander so-and-so, we can't do crap for you, really. Please understand that we're nobodies now. And of course, they don't believe it. And when somebody says, somebody says, what's up with my application? And we say, okay, we'll look into it, which we always do. And next week they get an interview or they get a phone call. They think we did something for them. Mm-hmm. So, of course, we're totally impotent in this regard, but they don't believe it. Mm-hmm. And they have a hard time understanding the system, of course, that we consider a mystery. So it just compounds the problems. And of course, we've had people pass away waiting. And people with many, many problems, right? These families have so many problems, physical, mental, whatever, you name it. And we are powerless to help them, except for what Badger 6 does financially for them. Now, which is extremely, extremely important, because many of our Afghan people, they're not being helped at all, and they're stuck. We know there's guys that probably should be on our list, but we can't take the lowest ranking people, and we're not accepting new applicants, this kind of stuff. We only can help a limited number of people, and that's very sad. Of course, we can't help everybody. But on the other side of things, I have to say, if you look at things, different ways, you get different outcomes, so to speak, in your mind. And one of the things is, okay, the government has failed us, essentially, in this regard. However, we live in a country where Justin and I and Shannon Spann and our other people can get together, create a charity, and get things done. We depend on our fellow Americans to give us assistance. We tap on the shoulders of those who we worked with and our friends and colleagues, and we're getting things done, basically providing sustenance and support and a morale boost to our Afghans. And we're able to say, please just wait. We'll help you. will try to help you in the meantime. Many people don't have that going for them. And in our country, we can do that. Where the government fails, we can step in. And that's what we're doing now. And I think we have to be proud of that and happy about that. And there's thousands probably other Americans who are in the same boat, who are working hard to help those who helped us. And we live in a great country where we can do that. We got to depend on the government for some things, but on other things, we don't have to, and we're succeeding in that regard.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's only so much you can do and so much you can control. I worked in a State Department mission in my last job, and that, in my estimation, didn't make a difference. In fact, if anything, I got in arguments with desk officers that worked on Afghanistan because, A, they had no ties to the country or the people. It was just a job for them. And so from their point of view, they were there to basically work the policy issues at the UN for Afghanistan. And then so I would get involved because I was, trying to help guys out. And, I got a lot of pushback from them. And I went to the mat with the ambassador, at least to defend the position and the sort of principle of this, right? And in the end, it didn't really matter at all. And then I quickly realized that there's only so much you can control. So you can raise money to support people, and that money is there to support people because the system's inefficient and they're stuck, in Central Asia or Afghanistan. So at least we can do that, and then we can advocate through organizations like the Moral Compass Foundation, where we get together once a month and we discuss things. And then we actually did House Foreign Affairs Committee testimony, a panel discussion, lobbying congressmen, which has had, mixed results. But that's all you can do. So you just have to focus on what you can change. And the seemingly arbitrary nature of the system is what it is. And you just have to work around it, I guess.
It's the story that so many of the volunteers who keep doing this effort have, right? They didn't quit. They knew that they were up against insurmountable odds and, a very callous bureaucracy, and they kept fighting and doing what they could. And it's incredible what you guys have done to support those families and to, keep memories alive from, Mike Spann, and that's effort. Is there anything else you want to share about Badger 6 before I have one final question for you that has nothing to do with this, and it's kind of more about the state of affairs in Afghanistan, but I'd love if you have closing remarks about Badger 6 or about this whole effort. I would love to hear them before I ask that question.
I have one comment. It's very interesting and almost always pleasant to see how our Afghans do when they do get here. We have several families here. We have a large family. I'll just mention the one in Idaho. We have a large family in Idaho, about 15 people, and all of the young men and women, adults, have jobs, except for the principal applicant, the older fella and his wife, who probably will never learn English. And but all those people have jobs, and to see that sort of patriotism exuded, their pro-Americanness that comes out. You can watch their Facebooks, their little Twitters. They're all savvy. They all speak English now. They all have jobs, as I said, and they're great Americans. They appreciate America. They appreciate what we've done for them, and they're going to be great Americans. They're on the path. And I think that that's the case for all of our families. These are people who fought for America, who have extremely high opinions of the United States and our way of life, and they're going to be great Americans. And that's the best thing that comes out of our efforts, is to see these people come here legally and successfully and become great Americans. And to me, that's what it's all about.
Yeah, and I think that's absolutely been my experience, and I think you can see it as the kids, the children as well of the principal applicants are now, whether they're in high school or whatever, they're doing well, and their English is great, and they have ambitions that just like, regular American kids. And so that's super encouraging, and that's very much the intent, the whole spirit of Badger 6 is to assimilate these folks in a meaningful way and make them, valuable members, contributing members of society here, which they are. I'll say one thing about Badger 6 for everyone's awareness who watches this is that, we don't have any paid board members. No one's paid. There's virtually very little overhead unless it's some sort of expense related to a fundraiser or something like that. Absolutely very little overhead, and all the money that we raise either goes to promote Badger 6 to raise more money or goes directly to support people who are waiting to be processed through the system and be brought to the United States. So it's very successful, and it's finite in its ambition or its in goal, 30 to 35 families. And in the end, once they're brought to the United States and they're go through the resettlement process, the mission will end. So it has, a defined beginning and very much like a defined ending.
Well, that's incredible. And I'm so grateful for what you're doing. And as I said, I have one last question because I have long felt, and so many people I know who are in this boat who don't have the long-standing tie to Afghanistan that both of you do, are very concerned about supporting. You've got Al-Qaeda senior leaders saying, send your people to Afghanistan to be trained. We know that there are training camps for Al-Qaeda in at least 12, if not 15 provinces, because they don't include, I think it's like Kapisa, Paktia, and Paktika, which are longtime hubs for that organization. And then in terms of women's issues, we're seeing a very marked return to the conditions of pre-9/11. And I wondered, you two were so intimately involved in those early days after the September 11th attacks, when we had to fight to get the country out of control of the Taliban and Al-Qaeda. What is it like for you to see affairs now, so many years later?
I mean, for me, having gone in early on, the very beginning, and then gone back multiple times, and then I, went to Iraq and then came back to Afghanistan. At the end of the day, the whole purpose and spirit of Operation Enduring Freedom and the whole initial operation, Task Force Dagger and all that, was to essentially hunt down Al-Qaeda and prevent Afghanistan from being used as a safe haven for terrorists. So to see these organizations, obviously whatever remnant of Al-Qaeda is there or reconstituting itself is the first and foremost concern. ISIS-K, another brand of terrorist organization. We've been fighting them in Syria, fighting them in the Euphrates River Valley, and now, we're dealing with the Afghan version, very concerning. And that's exactly what we don't want Afghanistan to be. So it very much goes against the whole purpose of why we went into 102. Yeah, and it's very discouraging. I don't have a lot of detailed information other than open source because I'm not in government anymore. But yeah, it's going to be a problem that we're going to have to deal with again at some point, unfortunately.
Yeah, I just agree with Justin there. I can talk forever, but I can't say much more than what Justin said then.
Yeah, I just wanted to ask you all, because it is something I know so many of us are really frustrated. The spotlight has turned away from Afghanistan, just as this is, well, not just as, it's been happening for years since the withdrawal, that the spotlight has progressively been turning away. And at the same time, we're seeing, like you said, Justin, ISIS-K often targeting Hazara or, visiting foreigners. They're all about the high profile nature of their disconcerting thing. But I have hope that we will not let the attacks of 9/11 happen again, and that we can bring that democracy that you all worked so hard to bring back to Afghanistan, to that we'll see that again. I don't think the Taliban can last forever. Well, and okay, if you have any, you guys, I gave you concluding remarks earlier, but I kind of took us off on that random path. So if you have anything to say that isn't entirely hopeless, because I like to end on a positive note, I would love to hear it. And otherwise, I'll do our wrap up.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I don't know if you can hear me. Things are breaking up a little bit, but yeah, I think being proactive now that we have a new administration coming in, that there are things that can be done that are well within the capability of the United States to deal with these problems, namely to prevent Afghanistan from being a sort of source of terrorism, not just regionally, but also, targeting the homeland of the United States, which is the whole kind of purpose of our counterterrorism policy. At least that's the stated purpose. So we're going after people in Somalia who are a threat to the homeland. And now we have this apparently sort of regenerating capability in Afghanistan. So we need to keep an eye on that, and we need to deal with it decisively. And I don't mean by sending 90,000 troops into Afghanistan like we did when I was there in 2011. But we were a powerful country, and we can deal with that problem in a decisive way, and I hope we do. If it is indeed the case that these capabilities have reconstituted, which I think it is.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I think the immigrants that have come here from Afghanistan are going to help us again when it's time to, when we need help again in Afghanistan, and that'll come. We have a lot of people now that speak the language, obviously, fluently, that know that country, and they'll be helping us in the future when the time comes. Don't know when it is, obviously, but Afghanistan's going to be an issue as long as the Taliban control it, and as long as the Taliban don't change. You have to have hope that the Afghan people, to include those Taliban members, will see the light, so to speak, and at least try or want to become a normal country again. I have hope about that. And the Afghans that have made it here are adapting very well, and they're becoming assets for us, and that tells you a lot about the Afghans and their resiliency and resourcefulness.
Those are great points. And David and Justin, I just can't tell you how much it means to me to have you here. All you've done for this country, for the people of Afghanistan. It was an immense honor to have you on the podcast, and I really wish Badger 6 so much success in getting these families out of Afghanistan and to safety. I want to thank our listeners too for sharing their time, for supporting the people of Afghanistan, and as always, Tasha Kaur, and hope to see you again soon.